The night my son Marcus forced me to sleep in that freezing basement during my 85th birthday week, I stared at the concrete ceiling and smiled. He thought he was punishing me, thought he was showing me who really held the power in this house. What Marcus didn't know was that I owned every single brick of his precious apartment complex downtown. The one he bragged about managing, the one that paid for his designer suits and expensive car. By the time I was done with him, he'd be the one sleeping in basements, and I'd be the landlord deciding whether he deserved a roof over his head at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It began on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the first frost had already kissed the windows of my little house on Maple Street. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten breakfast at for 43 years, reading the newspaper and sipping coffee from my favorite blue mug, when I heard Marcus's key turning in the front door. That sound used to make me happy, back when unexpected visits meant he wanted to spend time with his old mother. Now it just made my shoulders tense. Marcus walked into my kitchen like he owned the place, which in his mind, I suppose he thought he did. He was wearing one of those expensive wool coats that cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, and his hair was slicked back with enough product to waterproof a boat. At 38 years old, my son had grown into someone I barely recognized, someone who looked at me like I was an inconvenience, rather than the woman who had raised him alone after his father walked out when Marcus was just 7. He didn't say good morning, he didn't ask how I was feeling, or whether I needed anything from the store. Instead, he sat down across from me, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling through what looked like real estate listings while I finished my coffee in silence. The quiet stretched between us like a taut wire, and I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the little boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. Finally, he looked up from his phone with that practice smile he wore when he wanted something. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." The words came out smooth and rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them in his car on the drive over. He'd been dropping hints for months about property values and investment opportunities, always couched in language about what was best for me. But I wasn't born yesterday. I took a long sip of my coffee, using the time to study his face and think about my response. Marcus had always been impatient, even as a child, and I could see him shifting in his seat, waiting for me to thank him for solving all my problems. Instead, I set down my mug and looked him straight in the eye. "No." The word hung in the air between us like a slap. Marcus blinked, his practice smile faltering for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Mom, I don't think you're understanding what I'm trying to tell you. This isn't really a request. I'm worried about your safety, and as your son, I have a responsibility to make sure you're taken care of." There was something in his tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, something that sounded less like concern and more like a threat. I'd heard that tone before, years ago, when he was a teenager trying to manipulate me into letting him do something I'd already said no to. But this wasn't about staying out past curfew or borrowing the car. This was about my home, my independence, my entire life. I said, "No, Marcus. I'm not selling my house, and I'm not moving to some facility where I'll be treated like an invalid. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, and this is my home." I kept my voice calm and steady, but inside, my heart was racing. I'd never seen that particular look in my son's eyes before, and I didn't like it. Marcus leaned forward, his facade of patience starting to crack around the edges. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. I'm trying to help you here, but you're not making this easy. Do you really want to force me to take more drastic measures?" The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I felt my blood pressure rising, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of drastic measures are you talking about, Marcus?" He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he pressed on anyway. "Well, if you're not competent to make these kinds of decisions anymore, there are legal options. I could petition the court for guardianship. Have you declared mentally incompetent? Is that really what you want?" The words hit me like a physical blow. My own son was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my house. I sat there for a moment, processing the magnitude of his betrayal, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. This was the child I'd sacrificed everything for, the boy I'd worked 2 jobs to support. The young man I'd put through college by taking out a second mortgage on this very house he now wanted to sell. Get out. Marcus looked startled, like he hadn't expected me to fight back. Mom, let's be reasonable here. I'm just trying to look out for your best interests. Get out of my house, Marcus. Right now. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, and pointed toward the front door. And don't come back until you're ready to apologize and treat me with the respect I deserve. For a moment, I thought he might actually leave. He stood up, straightened his expensive coat, and picked up his phone. But instead of walking toward the door, he took a step closer to me, and his voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than if he'd been shouting. You're making a big mistake, Mom. I was trying to do this the easy way, but if you want to be stubborn about it, I can be stubborn too. This house is going to be sold, one way or another. The only question is whether you're going to cooperate, or whether I'm going to have to force the issue. He walked out then, leaving me standing in my kitchen with my hands shaking and my coffee growing cold. I heard his car start up in the driveway, heard him peel out like a teenager having a tantrum, and then silence settled over my house like a heavy blanket. I spent the rest of that morning trying to process what had just happened. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, looking for some sign that I'd misunderstood, that my son hadn't really just threatened to have me declared incompetent so he could steal my house. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, there was no other interpretation. Marcus had shown me exactly who he really was, and it was someone I didn't recognize. That afternoon, I called my friend Eleanor, who lived 3 blocks away and had been my closest confidant for the past 15 years. Eleanor had always been a straight shooter, never one to sugarcoat things or tell me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to hear. When I told her about my conversation with Marcus, she was quiet for a long moment before letting out a string of curse words that would have made a sailor blush. Leona, honey, you need to protect yourself. If Marcus is serious about this guardianship threat, he could cause you real problems. You need to get your affairs in order and make sure you have legal protection. Eleanor had gone through something similar with her own nephew a few years back, so she knew what she was talking about. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, looking around at all the memories that filled this space. The piano where Marcus had practiced scales for hours when he was 10. The bookshelf I'd built with my own hands when I couldn't afford to buy one. The family photos that chronicled our life together, back when we actually were a family instead of whatever this had become. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made to give Marcus opportunities I'd never had. The nights I'd worked double shifts at the diner to pay for his baseball equipment. The way I'd eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so he could have proper meals. The college fund I'd built penny by penny, dollar by dollar, even when it meant I couldn't afford to fix the leaky roof or replace the old furnace. And now he wanted to take my house, the one thing I had left that was truly mine, and stuff me away in some facility where I'd be forgotten. Well, Marcus was about to learn that his old mother wasn't going down without a fight. He might think he held all the cards, but he had no idea what I was really capable of. The next few days passed quietly, and I almost let myself believe that maybe Marcus had thought better of his threats, that maybe he'd come to his senses and realize what he was asking of me. But I should have known better. Marcus had never been the type to give up on something he wanted, especially when money was involved. The first sign that things were about to get worse came on Friday morning, when I found a letter in my mailbox from something called Pinnacle Property Management. The letter was addressed to me, but it was clearly meant to feel official and intimidating. It informed me that my property had been flagged for potential code violations and that an inspection would be conducted within the next 2 weeks. I'd lived in this house for over 40 years, and I'd never had a code violation in my life. I kept my property immaculate, my lawn mowed, my paint fresh. This was clearly Marcus's doing, though I couldn't prove it. He was trying to create a paper trail that would support his claim that I wasn't capable of maintaining my home. The inspection happened the following Tuesday. 2 men in hard hats and clipboards showed up at my door, claiming they were responding to a complaint about potential safety hazards. They spent 2 hours going through my house with fine-tooth combs, looking for anything they could cite me for. They found a loose board on my back porch steps, a small crack in my basement wall, and declared that my electrical panel was potentially outdated. None of these things were serious problems.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The loose board was something I could fix with a hammer and a nail. The crack in the basement wall had been there for 20 years and wasn't getting any bigger. And my electrical panel had been inspected and approved just 3 years ago. But somehow, by the end of the week, I had 3 official citations and a notice that I had 30 days to address these serious safety concerns or face potential legal action. I knew this was all Marcus's doing. He was building a case against me, creating documentation that would support his claim that I wasn't capable of maintaining my property. And if I couldn't maintain my property, how could I be trusted to make decisions about my own life? But Marcus wasn't done. The real humiliation came the following Monday, when he showed up at my door again, this time with a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, maybe 30, wearing a business suit and carrying a leather briefcase that screamed authority. "Mom, this is Sandra Walsh from Adult Protective Services. She's here to do a wellness check." Marcus's voice was all fake concern and barely concealed satisfaction. He'd called APS on his own mother. Sandra Walsh was professional but thorough. She asked me questions about my daily routine, my health, my finances. She looked through my refrigerator to make sure I had adequate food. She checked my medication cabinet to ensure I was taking my prescriptions properly. She inspected my house for signs of neglect or dangerous conditions. Through it all, Marcus stood in my living room with his arms crossed, watching like a hawk for any sign that I might say or do something that would support his case against me. I answered every question calmly and honestly, but inside I was seething. My own son had sicked social services on me like I was some kind of neglected child instead of an adult woman who'd been taking care of herself longer than he'd been alive. Sandra Walsh found nothing wrong, of course, because there was nothing wrong. I was healthy, competent, and fully capable of caring for myself. But the fact that there was now an APS file with my name on it was exactly what Marcus had been hoping for. Another piece of documentation to support his eventual guardianship petition. After Sandra left, Marcus lingered in my living room, pretending to be concerned about the outcome of the visit. "Well, that went better than I expected," he said, like he'd been genuinely worried about my welfare rather than orchestrating the whole thing. "But Mom, you have to understand that this is just going to keep happening until you accept help." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt something break inside my chest. "What kind of help are you talking about, Marcus?" His smile was all sharp edges and false sympathy. "I've been doing some research, and I found a really nice place about an hour outside the city. Sunset Manor. It's got everything you could want. Activities, medical care, social opportunities. And the best part is, it's got an opening available right now." "I told you, I'm not interested in moving to any kind of facility." Marcus's expression hardened. "Mom, I don't think you're understanding the situation you're in here. You've got code violations on your property. You've had APS called on you. If you keep fighting this, things are just going to get worse. I'm trying to give you a choice here, but my patience isn't unlimited." The threat was clear. Cooperate or he'd escalate things further. I wondered how far he was willing to go, how much damage he was prepared to do to his own mother to get what he wanted. But I wasn't ready to find out. "I need some time to think about it," I said, buying myself space to figure out my next move. Marcus nodded, satisfied that he was finally wearing down my resistance. "That's reasonable. But don't take too long, Mom. The longer you wait, the fewer options you're going to have." After he left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to think clearly about my situation. Marcus was systematically destroying my reputation and my independence, building a case that would allow him to take control of my life and my assets. He was using the legal system, social services, and his own position as my son to manipulate the situation in his favor. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He thought I was just some helpless old woman who would eventually cave under pressure. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. My son might think he was the only one who knew how to play hardball, but he was about to learn that his mother had been playing that game longer than he'd been alive. That night, I made some phone calls. to my lawyer, James Morrison, who'd handled my will and estate planning for the past 20 years, to my doctor to get copies of my recent medical records that proved I was in excellent health for my age, to my bank to make sure all my accounts were secure and that only I had access to them. But most importantly, I called my friend Margaret, who worked in the records department at the county courthouse. Margaret owed me a favor from when I'd helped her daughter get a job at the diner where I used to work. It was time to call in that favor. Margaret, I need you to help me look up some property records. Specifically, I need to know everything you can find about Riverside Apartments on 4th Street. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Leona, honey, why are you asking about Riverside? That's a pretty big complex. I smiled, thinking about the expression that was going to be on Marcus's face when he found out the truth. Let's just say I'm thinking about making some changes to my investment portfolio. The irony was beautiful, really. Marcus thought he was so clever, managing that apartment complex, collecting rent from dozens of tenants, living off the income from what he assumed was someone else's property. He had no idea that the little old lady he was trying to steamroll had been making strategic real estate investments for decades, quietly building a portfolio that included the very building he thought gave him such power and prestige. I'd bought Riverside Apartments 15 years ago, back when Marcus was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. It had been a distressed property, and I'd gotten it for a fraction of what it was worth today. I'd hired a management company to handle the day-to-day operations, and the income had been quietly padding my retirement fund ever since. Marcus had gotten his job there, through what he thought was his own networking and charm. He had no idea that his mother owned the place, that every dollar of his salary was ultimately coming from her bank account. The management company reported to me, not to him, though he'd never bothered to look closely enough at the corporate structure to realize it. But now it was time for Marcus to learn exactly who held the real power in this family. He wanted to play games with my housing situation? Fine, I could play that game too. And unlike him, I actually owned the board. The next morning, I got dressed in my best outfit, the navy blue suit I'd worn to Marcus's college graduation, and drove downtown to the offices of Pinnacle Property Management. It was time to have a conversation with my property manager about the future of Riverside Apartments, and more specifically, about the future of Marcus's employment there. Marcus thought he was backing me into a corner, forcing me to choose between my independence and my security. What he didn't realize was that he'd just picked a fight with someone who had more resources, more patience, and a much better understanding of how the real world actually worked than he'd ever given her credit for. My son wanted to see what happened when you tried to destroy someone who'd spent their whole life fighting for everything they had. He was about to find out exactly what his mother was made of, and it wasn't going to be the sweet, helpless old lady he thought he could manipulate and control. The game was about to change, and Marcus had no idea that he'd been playing by my rules all along. Walking into the offices of Pinnacle Property Management felt like stepping into enemy territory, except I was the one who owned the battlefield. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looked up from her computer as I approached her desk. She probably saw just another elderly woman, someone to be politely dismissed or redirected to someone else's problem. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice pleasant but firm. "I'd like to speak with Robert Chen about the Riverside Apartments property." Her smile flickered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "Mr. Chen is quite busy today, and we typically require advanced scheduling for property consultations." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing documents I'd retrieved from my safety deposit box that morning. "I think he'll want to see me. Tell him Leona Davis is here to discuss her property portfolio." The way her expression changed when she looked at the letterhead on my documents was almost comical. Her eyes widened and she suddenly sat up straighter in her chair. "Oh, Mrs. Davis, of course. Let me call Mr. Chen right away." Within 5 minutes, I was sitting in Robert Chen's corner office, looking out at a view of the city that included the Riverside Apartments building in the distance. Robert was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed and clearly nervous about this unexpected visit from one of his most valuable clients. He'd been managing my properties for over a decade, but we'd only met in person a handful of times, usually communicating through phone calls and quarterly reports. Mrs. Davis, this is certainly a pleasant surprise. I hope everything is well with your investments. Your properties have been performing exceptionally well, particularly Riverside. The occupancy rate is at 97%, and we've been able to increase rents across the board without any significant tenant loss. I nodded politely, but I wasn't here for a financial update. Robert, I need to discuss something specific about Riverside. I understand you have a property manager there named Marcus Davis. Robert's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him trying to work out the connection. Yes, Marcus has been with us for about 8 months now. He's been doing excellent work, very professional, very dedicated to maintaining the property standards. Is there some kind of issue? The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had been getting glowing reviews for managing a property he had no idea belonged to his own mother. Marcus is my son, Robert. And there's definitely an issue, but not the kind you might expect. I spent the next 30 minutes explaining the situation to Robert, watching his expression grow increasingly troubled as I laid out Marcus's threats, his attempts to have me declared incompetent, and his plan to force me out of my home so he could steal the proceeds from its sale. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his professional demeanor giving way to something that looked like genuine concern. Mrs. Davis, I have to say, this puts us in a very difficult position. Marcus is technically an employee of the management company, not a direct employee of yours, and his job performance has been exemplary. But if what you're telling me is true, then we're dealing with serious ethical issues that go beyond workplace conduct. I leaned forward in my chair, meeting his gaze directly. Robert, I'm not asking you to fire my son because we're having a family disagreement. I'm telling you that he's attempting to commit elder abuse and fraud against the owner of one of your largest properties. I think that creates a pretty clear conflict of interest, don't you? Robert was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. What exactly are you asking me to do? This was the moment I'd been planning for since I'd realized the full scope of Marcus's betrayal. I want you to schedule a mandatory staff meeting for all Riverside employees next Monday at 10 a.m. I want to address the entire staff about some upcoming changes to the property management structure. And I want you to make sure Marcus is there. The color drained from Robert's face. Mrs. Davis, are you sure that's the approach you want to take? This could be quite explosive. I smiled, thinking about all the nights I'd lain awake planning this moment. Robert, my son thinks he can intimidate and manipulate me because he sees me as just another helpless old woman. It's time he learned exactly who he's been dealing with. After leaving Pinnacle, I drove home with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. But my satisfaction was short-lived. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Marcus's car parked on the street, and my stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. He was sitting on my front porch, and even from a distance, I could tell he was agitated. As I walked up my front walkway, Marcus stood up and started toward me, his face flushed with anger. Where the hell have you been, Mom? I've been waiting here for over an hour. The aggression in his voice was new, more open than his previous attempts at manipulation. I had some errands to run. What do you want, Marcus? He stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and see the tension lines around his eyes. We need to talk, now, about your attitude and about the decisions you're going to need to make. I unlocked my front door and went inside, with Marcus following close behind. But instead of sitting down in the living room like we usually did, he remained standing, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His whole demeanor had changed from fake concern to barely controlled hostility. Mom, I've been trying to be patient with you, trying to do this the nice way, but you're not giving me much choice here. I got a call from Sunset Manor today. They're holding that spot for you, but not indefinitely. You need to make a decision. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and turned to face him. I already made my decision, Marcus. I'm staying in my home. His face darkened, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that actually frightened me. This wasn't the son I'd raised. This wasn't even the manipulative young man who'd been threatening me for the past few weeks. This was someone I didn't recognize at all. That's not an option anymore, Mom. I've already started the paperwork for the guardianship petition. I have documentation of your code violations, the APS visit, evidence that you're not capable of making sound decisions about your welfare. You can cooperate and make this easy on both of us, or you can fight it and make things much harder on yourself. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather rather than destroying my life, made my blood run cold. Marcus, what has happened to you? When did you become someone who would do this to his own mother? For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been shame flicker across his face. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by cold determination. This isn't about what I want, Mom. This is about reality. You're old, you're stubborn, and you're sitting on assets that you're not using productively. I'm trying to help you, but I'm also trying to secure my own future. Is that really so terrible? There it was. The truth, finally. This wasn't about my welfare or my safety. This was about Marcus wanting access to my money, my house, my assets. He saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and what he considered his inheritance. So that's what this is really about. Money? Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me with something that might have been pity. Mom, everything is about money. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us. I'm not the villain here. I'm just being practical. I felt something shift inside me. A kind of cold clarity that comes when you finally see a situation for exactly what it is. Get out of my house, Marcus. He laughed, actually laughed, like I'd said something amusing. I don't think you're in a position to be making demands, Mom. In fact, I think it's time we establish some new ground rules about how things are going to work around here. Before I could ask what he meant, Marcus walked over to my kitchen drawer and pulled out a notepad and pen. He wrote something down, tore off the sheet, and handed it to me. It was a list of rules, written in his neat handwriting like he was disciplining a child. The list included things like, no visitors without prior approval. All medical appointments must be scheduled through Marcus. No major purchases without consultation. And quote, weekly check-ins mandatory. At the bottom, he'd written, failure to comply will result in immediate guardianship proceedings. I stared at the paper, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. Marcus, you can't be serious. His expression was completely serious. I'm trying to transition you gradually, Mom, help you get used to having structure and supervision. If you cooperate, this can be a smooth process. If you don't, well, we'll do it the hard way. That's when I realized that Marcus wasn't just trying to steal from me. He was trying to break me, to destroy my spirit so completely that I'd be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity he decided to leave me. He wanted me to become exactly the helpless, confused old woman he was pretending I already was. And if I refused to follow your rules? Marcus smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on his face. Then you'll find out exactly how unpleasant I can make your life. You think those code violations were bad? You think that APS visit was embarrassing? Mom, you have no idea what I'm capable of when I really put my mind to it. The threat hung in the air between us like a poison cloud. I looked at my son, this person I'd loved unconditionally for 38 years, and realized that he was prepared to torture me psychologically until I surrendered everything I'd worked for my entire life. But Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a frail, isolated old woman who had no resources and no allies. He had no idea that I'd been quietly building power and influence for decades, that I had connections and assets he couldn't even imagine. He was about to learn that threatening Leona Davis was the biggest mistake of his life. That evening, after Marcus finally left with his ultimatum hanging over my head, I made a series of phone calls. First to James Morrison, my attorney, to schedule an emergency meeting. Then to Dr. Patricia Williams, my physician, to request a comprehensive mental competency evaluation. Then to Eleanor and Margaret, to ask for their help with what I was planning. But the most important call was to my granddaughter Lisa, Marcus's daughter from his first marriage. Lisa was 22 years old, studying social work at the State University, and she had no idea what her father was planning. She also had no idea that her grandmother had been quietly funding her education through an anonymous scholarship program. Grandma Leona, what a nice surprise. How are you doing? Lisa's voice was warm and genuine, so different from her father's calculated tones. I'd always been closer to her than Marcus had ever been, and she'd often confided in me about her troubles and dreams. Now I needed her help, though I wasn't sure how to ask for it without putting her in an impossible position. Lisa, sweetheart, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has your father said anything to you recently about my health or my living situation? There was a pause, and I could practically hear her thinking. Well, he mentioned that he was worried about you living alone. He said something about maybe helping you find a nice retirement community. Why? I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Marcus hadn't tried to poison Lisa against me, and sadness that I was about to shatter her illusions about her father. Lisa, I need to tell you some things about what your father has been doing, and I need you to listen with an open mind. I spent the next hour explaining everything to Lisa, from Marcus's initial threats to his escalating campaign of harassment and intimidation. I told her about the forged complaints, the APS visit, the ultimatum he'd given me that very afternoon. I tried to be fair, to present the facts without editorial commentary, but the facts spoke for themselves. Lisa was quiet for a long time after I finished. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and shaky. Grandma, are you sure? I mean, I know Dad can be intense sometimes, but this sounds like something out of a movie. I understood her disbelief. It's hard to accept that someone you love is capable of such cruelty, especially when that person is your parent. Lisa, I know this is hard to believe, but I wouldn't make something like this up. I'm scared, honey. I'm scared of what your father might do next. That seemed to get through to her. Lisa had always been protective of the people she cared about, and the idea that I was genuinely frightened seemed to override her loyalty to her father. What can I do to help? I'd been hoping she would ask that question. I need you to be my witness, Lisa. I need someone from our family to see what's really happening here, someone who can testify that I'm competent and capable if this goes to court. And I need you to help me document everything your father does from now on. Lisa agreed immediately, and we made plans for her to visit that weekend. But I also made her promise not to tell Marcus about our conversation. If he knew that Lisa was aware of his plans, he might escalate things faster than I was prepared to handle. The next few days passed in an eerie calm, like the silence before a thunderstorm. Marcus didn't call or visit, which was somehow more unsettling than his threats had been. I knew he was planning something, probably consulting with lawyers about the guardianship petition or gathering more evidence of my supposed incompetence. Meanwhile, I was making preparations of my own. James Morrison scheduled the emergency meeting for Thursday afternoon, and Dr. Williams agreed to conduct a full mental competency evaluation on Friday morning. I also started documenting everything, writing down every conversation I'd had with Marcus, every threat he'd made, every intimidation tactic he'd tried. But the most important preparation was emotional. I had to accept that the son I'd loved and raised was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his financial goals. The Marcus who used to bring me flowers on Mother's Day, who called me when he was scared or lonely, who once told me I was the strongest person he knew. That person either never existed or had been buried so deep under greed and selfishness that he was unreachable. Thursday's meeting with James Morrison was both enlightening and terrifying. James was a good lawyer, thorough and experienced, but even he seemed shaken by the scope of Marcus's campaign against me. Liana, I have to be honest with you. Guardianship cases can be very difficult to defend, especially when the petitioner is a family member who appears to have the elderly person's best interests at heart. Courts tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to protecting vulnerable adults. I felt my heart sink. Are you saying I can't fight this? James shook his head. I'm saying we need to be strategic. The good news is that you're clearly competent, you have no serious health issues, and you're capable of managing your own affairs. The bad news is that Marcus has been building a paper trail that could be persuasive to a judge who doesn't know you personally. We spent 2 hours going over every piece of documentation, every interaction, every threat. James took detailed notes and explained the legal process, what I could expect if Marcus actually filed the guardianship petition, and what our defense strategy would look like. The key is going to be demonstrating that Marcus's concerns aren't genuine, that this is motivated by financial gain rather than legitimate worry about your welfare. If we can show a pattern of coercion and intimidation, that will work in our favor. By the time I left James's office, I felt better prepared, but more anxious than ever. The legal system was complex and unpredictable, and there was no guarantee that justice would prevail, especially when it came to family disputes involving elderly people. Friday's mental competency evaluation with Dr. Williams went smoothly. She'd been my doctor for over 15 years, and she knew me well enough to recognize that I was functioning at a high level for someone my age. The evaluation included cognitive tests, memory assessments, and a thorough discussion of my daily activities and decision-making processes. "Leona, you're sharper than most people half your age," Dr. Williams said as she finished her notes. "I'll have the written report ready by Monday, but I can tell you right now that there's absolutely no indication of cognitive decline or impaired judgment. If someone tries to claim you're incompetent, they're going to have to find a different doctor to support their case." That weekend, Lisa came to visit as promised. Seeing her reminded me of what family was supposed to feel like. The unconditional love and support that Marcus had twisted into something ugly and manipulative. Lisa was smart, observant, and genuinely concerned about my welfare, but she was also horrified by her father's behavior. "Grandma, I've been thinking about what you told me, and I've been remembering some things that didn't make sense at the time. Like how Dad's been asking me questions about your daily routine, whether you seem confused or forgetful, stuff like that. I thought he was just being caring, but now it seemed like Marcus had been gathering intelligence, pumping his own daughter for information he could use against me." The realization seemed to break something inside Lisa, and she spent most of Saturday alternating between anger and heartbreak. "I don't understand how he became this person," she said as we sat in my kitchen, sharing a pot of tea and a plate of cookies I'd made that morning. "He used to be different, didn't he? When I was little, he seemed like he actually cared about people." I thought about that question for a long time. When had Marcus changed? When had his natural ambition curdled into greed? When had his desire for success become more important than his relationships with the people who loved him? I couldn't pinpoint an exact moment, but somewhere along the way, my son had lost his moral compass, and I'd been too blind or too hopeful to see it happening. Sunday evening, just as Lisa was getting ready to drive back to campus, Marcus showed up unexpectedly. I saw his car pull into the driveway, and my stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. Lisa saw him too, and I watched her face go through a series of emotions, settling finally on a cold determination that reminded me of myself. Marcus came to the front door like he owned the place, letting himself in without knocking or waiting for permission. When he saw Lisa in my living room, his expression shifted from its usual fake pleasantness to something much more calculating. "Lisa, what a surprise. I didn't know you were visiting your grandmother this weekend." Lisa stood up from the couch, and I could see her hands shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "Hi, Dad. Grandma and I were just catching up." Marcus looked back and forth between us, and I could practically see his mind working, trying to figure out what we'd been discussing. "That's nice. Family time is important. Leona, I hope you've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about the decisions you need to make." The way he said it, with Lisa standing right there, was clearly intended to put me on the spot. He probably figured I wouldn't want to air our dirty laundry in front of his daughter, that I'd be too embarrassed or too protective of Lisa to call him out on his behavior. He was wrong. Actually, Marcus, Lisa and I have been discussing exactly that. I've told her all about your threats, your attempts at manipulation, and your plans to have me declared incompetent so you can steal my house. The color drained from Marcus's face, and for a moment he looked genuinely shocked. He clearly hadn't expected me to involve Lisa, hadn't counted on his daughter learning the truth about his character. "Mom, that's not. Lisa, you have to understand. Your grandmother is confused about the situation. I'm trying to help her, but she's being paranoid and irrational." Lisa looked at her father with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of disappointment and disgust that seemed to age her several years in an instant. "Dad, I've spent the whole weekend with Grandma. She's not confused about anything. She's been showing me documents, playing me recordings, explaining things in detail. I know exactly what you've been doing." Marcus's facade cracked completely, revealing the ugly desperation underneath. "Lisa, you don't understand the situation. Your grandmother is sitting on assets that could benefit our whole family. She's being selfish, holding on to things she doesn't need while the rest of us struggle. That was the wrong thing to say. Lisa had been working multiple jobs to pay for college, had been living on ramen noodles and dollar store coffee, had been wearing the same winter coat for 3 years because she couldn't afford a new one. The idea that her father saw her grandmother's reluctance to be robbed as selfish clearly struck a nerve. Struggle? Dad, you drive a BMW. You live in a luxury apartment. You wear suits that cost more than I make in a month. What exactly are you struggling with? Marcus realized he'd revealed too much, shown his true motivations too clearly. He tried to backtrack, to return to his earlier manipulative tactics, but it was too late. Lisa had seen behind the mask, and there was no putting it back on. You know what, Dad? I think you should leave. Grandma doesn't want you here, and after what I've learned this weekend, I don't want you here either. For a moment, I thought Marcus might actually explode. His face went red, his hands clenched into fists, and I could see him struggling to maintain some semblance of control. But then something seemed to click in his mind, and his expression went cold and calculating again. Fine. But don't think this changes anything. Mom, you still have until the end of next week to make your decision. After that, I file the paperwork, and this gets out of our hands. Lisa, I'm disappointed that your grandmother has dragged you into this mess, but you'll understand someday that I was trying to do the right thing. He left then, but not before giving us both a look that was pure malice. After his car disappeared down the street, Lisa and I sat in my living room, both of us shaken by the confrontation. Grandma, he's really going to do it, isn't he? He's really going to try to have you declared incompetent. I nodded, feeling tired but also strangely relieved. The pretense was over. Marcus had shown his true colors to both of us, and now we knew exactly what we were dealing with. No more manipulation disguised as concern, no more fake family loyalty. This was war, plain and simple. Yes, honey, I think he is. But he's made one very big mistake. Lisa looked at me curiously. What's that? I smiled, thinking about Monday's staff meeting at Riverside Apartments, about the look that was going to be on Marcus's face when he discovered the truth. He thinks he's the only one in this family who knows how to fight dirty. He's about to learn that his old grandmother has been playing this game a lot longer than he has. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I had spent all of Sunday night planning exactly what I was going to say, how I was going to reveal the truth about Marcus's situation. By the time Monday arrived, I was more nervous than I'd been since the whole ordeal started, but I was also more determined than ever to see this through to the end. Marcus had no idea what was coming for him. He thought he held all the cards, thought he had me backed into a corner with no way out. He was about to discover that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who ends up holding all the power. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and clear. I dressed carefully in my best charcoal gray suit, the one I'd worn to important business meetings back when I was still working. My hands were steady as I applied my lipstick and checked my appearance one final time in the hallway mirror. Today was the day Marcus would learn exactly who he'd been threatening, and I wanted to look like the formidable woman I'd always been, not the helpless victim he imagined me to be. Robert Chen had arranged everything perfectly. The staff meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the community room at Riverside Apartments, and he'd made sure that every employee would be there, including Marcus. As far as Marcus knew, this was just another routine meeting about property management policies and upcoming maintenance schedules. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse around him. I arrived at Riverside Apartments at 9:30, giving myself time to walk through the property and remind myself of everything I owned. The building was beautiful, a converted historic factory with exposed brick walls and large windows that filled the apartments with natural light. I'd spent considerable money over the years upgrading the units, installing modern appliances and fixtures while maintaining the building's character. The rental income had been substantial, more than enough to fund my comfortable retirement and still leave plenty for reinvestment. Marcus's office was on the first floor, next to the leasing center, and I could see him through the glass door as I walked past. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing what looked like maintenance reports, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother owned the building where he worked. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. For months, he'd been bragging about his important job managing a premier downtown property, never knowing that every dollar of his salary ultimately came from my bank account. Robert met me in the lobby, looking nervous but determined. "Mrs. Davis, are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back." I looked around at the property I'd bought and improved, at the dozens of families who called this place home, at the business I'd built through careful planning and smart investments. "Robert, my son thinks he can intimidate me because he sees me as just another helpless old woman. It's time he learned exactly what kind of woman raised him." The community room was filling up with employees when we arrived. I recognized a few faces from my occasional visits over the years, though most of the staff had no idea who I was. Marcus was sitting in the front row, checking his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he was indispensable. He glanced up when Robert and I entered, and I saw confusion flicker across his face as he tried to figure out why some random elderly woman was attending a staff meeting. Robert called the meeting to order, going through the usual preliminaries about building occupancy rates and maintenance schedules. Marcus participated actively, asking questions and offering suggestions with the confidence of someone who thought he was being groomed for bigger responsibilities. If only he knew how right he was, just not in the way he expected. "Before we conclude today's meeting," Robert said, "I'd like to introduce someone very important to everyone here. This is Mrs. Leona Davis, and she has something she'd like to share with all of you." I stood up slowly, taking my time to walk to the front of the room. Marcus was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm, clearly trying to figure out what his mother was doing at his workplace. The rest of the staff looked politely interested, but had no idea they were about to witness one of the most devastating revelations in corporate history. "Good morning, everyone. I know most of you don't know me, but I know all of you, at least by reputation. For the past 15 years, I've been reading Robert's quarterly reports about this property, about the excellent work all of you do to maintain these apartments and serve our tenants." I could see Marcus's face going pale as he started to piece together what was happening. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "You see, I'm not just a random visitor here today. I'm the owner of this property. I bought Riverside Apartments in 2009, and I've been your landlord ever since, though I've preferred to let Pinnacle Property Management handle the day-to-day operations." The room was completely silent now, everyone processing this information, but I wasn't finished. I turned to look directly at Marcus, who was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "I'm particularly interested in meeting our property manager, Marcus Davis. Marcus, would you please stand up?" Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but he had no choice but to stand. Every eye in the room was on him now, and I could see the confusion on his colleagues' faces as they tried to understand the connection between the property owner and their manager. "Marcus has been doing excellent work here, according to all reports. Very professional, very dedicated to maintaining high standards. Of course, what makes his performance particularly interesting is that Marcus is my son." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed around the room, and I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," under their breath. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick, swaying slightly on his feet as he realized that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Now you might wonder why I'm sharing this information with all of you today. The reason is that Marcus has been under the impression that he works for someone else, that his job security and his future depend on impressing some faceless corporate entity. But the truth is, every dollar of his salary comes from my accounts. Every decision about this property ultimately goes through me, and every evaluation of his performance lands on my desk. I paused, letting that information sink in before delivering the final blow. Unfortunately, I've recently learned some very disturbing things about Marcus's character and judgment outside of work. You see, my son has been trying to force me out of my own home so he can steal the proceeds from its sale. He's threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent, filed false complaints about my property, and even called Adult Protective Services on me in an attempt to build a case for guardianship. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus was standing frozen, his face cycling through emotions so rapidly I could barely keep track. Shock, horror, rage, and something that might have been shame all flickered across his features. Marcus seems to believe that I'm just a confused old woman with no resources and no power to fight back. He's been systematically trying to destroy my reputation and my independence so he can gain control of my assets. What he didn't realize is that those assets include this building, along with several other properties in the area. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing the official ownership documents, property deeds, and corporate filings that proved every word I was saying. I have all the paperwork here if anyone would like to verify these facts. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Mom, what are you doing? This is my job. These are my colleagues. I turned to face him fully, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in complete control of the situation. Marcus, you threatened to destroy my life if I didn't cooperate with your demands. You told me you'd make my existence so miserable that I'd be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity you decided to leave me. Well, now you know how that feels. The room was still silent, but I could see people exchanging glances, putting together pieces of a puzzle that painted Marcus in a very unflattering light. These were good people, honest people, who took pride in their work and their integrity. The idea that their manager was trying to abuse and defraud his own mother was clearly shocking to them. Robert stepped forward, his professional demeanor barely masking his own shock at these revelations. Mrs. Davis, given what you've shared with us today, I think we need to discuss the implications for Mr. Davis's continued employment with Pinnacle Property Management. Marcus's head snapped around to stare at Robert, panic replacing the shock in his expression. Robert? You can't be serious. This is a family dispute. It has nothing to do with my job performance. I shook my head. Marcus, you told me that everything is about money, that I should accept that reality. Well, here's a reality for you. This building generates over $2 million in annual rental income. Do you really think I'm going to allow someone who's actively trying to defraud me to continue managing my most valuable asset? The implications were sinking in now, not just for Marcus, but for everyone in the room. The comfortable little world where Marcus was the important manager and I was just his elderly mother had been turned completely upside down. Now everyone knew that I held all the real power, that Marcus's entire career depended on my continued goodwill. Furthermore, I continued, I've been thinking about making some changes to how this property is managed. The current arrangement has worked well, but given recent developments, I think it's time for a more hands-on approach. Marcus's voice was desperate now. Mom, please. Can we talk about this privately? This doesn't need to involve everyone else. But I wasn't finished. I'd spent weeks being humiliated and threatened by my own son, and turnabout was fair play. Marcus, you made it very clear that privacy wasn't something you were interested in when you called APS on me, when you filed false complaints about my property, when you tried to turn my neighbors against me. You wanted to air our family business in public forums, so let's do that. I turned back to address the room. I want everyone here to understand exactly what kind of person has been representing this property. Marcus has been using his position here, his apparent success and respectability, as evidence that he should be trusted with more responsibility in our family's financial affairs. He's been leveraging your respect and his professional reputation to try to convince people that he's the responsible adult, and I'm the confused elderly parent who needs supervision. One of the maintenance workers, an older man named George, who I'd met during previous visits, raised his hand tentatively. Mrs. Davis, are you saying that Marcus has been lying to us about his situation? I nodded. George, Marcus has been telling people that he's concerned about my mental competency, that I'm no longer capable of managing my own affairs. He's been building a case to have me declared legally incompetent so he can gain control of my assets. But as you can all see, I'm perfectly capable of making complex business decisions, managing property investments, and protecting my own interests. Marcus was shaking now. Whether from rage or desperation, I couldn't tell. This is insane. Mom, you're destroying my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for. I looked at him with the kind of cold assessment I usually reserved for bad investment opportunities. Marcus, you were prepared to destroy my life for money. The only difference is that I actually have the power to back up my threats. Robert cleared his throat. Mrs. Davis, what exactly are you proposing in terms of Marcus's employment status? This was the moment I'd been building toward, the culmination of all my planning and preparation. Effective immediately, Marcus Davis is terminated from his position as property manager. His access to the building, the leasing office, and all property management systems is revoked. Security will escort him from the premises. The gasps around the room were audible this time. Marcus looked like he'd been struck by lightning, staring at me in complete disbelief. "You can't do this. I have a contract. I have rights." I smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. "Marcus, I own this building. I employ the management company that employs you. Your contract is with Pinnacle, and Pinnacle serves at my pleasure. As of right now, you're unemployed." Robert was already on his phone, calling building security. Marcus stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by his former colleagues, looking lost and defeated. For the first time in our recent interactions, he seemed to understand that he wasn't in control of the situation. "But that's not all," I continued, because I wasn't nearly finished with my son. "You see, Marcus has been living in a luxury apartment downtown, driving an expensive car, wearing designer clothes, all on the salary from this job. A job that, as it turns out, was essentially me paying my own son to manage my own property. But now that employment has ended, and I'm curious to see how he's going to maintain his lifestyle." Marcus's face had gone from pale to gray. "Mom, you can't do this to me. I'm your son." I stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear what I said next. "Marcus, you told me that being your son didn't give me any special protection from your threats. Well, being my son doesn't give you any special protection from the consequences of those threats either." Security arrived then, two professional-looking men who clearly knew how to handle delicate situations. Robert spoke to them quietly, explaining that Marcus was no longer employed and needed to be escorted from the building. They were polite but firm, asking Marcus to collect any personal belongings from his office before leaving the premises. As Marcus walked toward his former office, flanked by security guards, I addressed the remaining staff one more time. "I want to assure all of you that Marcus's termination has nothing to do with your performance or job security. You've all been doing excellent work, and I have no intention of making any other changes to the management structure. Robert will be appointing an interim property manager while we search for a permanent replacement." The meeting dispersed slowly, with people filing out in small groups, whispering among themselves about what they'd just witnessed. Several employees stopped to shake my hand or thank me for clarifying the situation, clearly relieved that their jobs weren't in jeopardy despite the drama they'd just witnessed. Marcus emerged from his office carrying a small box of personal items, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. As he passed by me, he leaned in close and whispered, "This isn't over, Mom. You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." I met his gaze steadily. "Marcus, you're absolutely right. This is just the beginning. But not in the way you think." After Marcus was escorted from the building, Robert and I went back to his office to discuss the transition plan. He was still clearly shaken by the morning's revelations, but he was also professional enough to focus on the business implications of what had just happened. "Mrs. Davis, I have to ask, are you planning to take a more active role in managing the property going forward?" I had been thinking about that exact question for weeks. "Robert, I'm 85 years old, and while I'm certainly capable of making major decisions about my investments, I don't want to be involved in the day-to-day operations. But I do want better oversight of who we hire and what kind of background checks we do on our employees." We spent the next hour going over personnel files, lease agreements, and maintenance schedules. It felt good to be back in control of my business affairs, to be making decisions based on logic and experience rather than reacting to threats and manipulation. But even as we worked through the practical details, I knew that Marcus wouldn't simply accept defeat and walk away. He'd spent too much time and energy on his plan to destroy my independence, and his financial situation was now desperate. Losing his job meant losing his income, his apartment, his car, and his entire lifestyle. He'd be looking for ways to salvage something from the wreckage, and that made him more dangerous than ever. Around noon, Robert's assistant knocked on the door to tell us that there was a situation in the lobby. Marcus had returned to the building, demanding to speak with me and refusing to leave when security asked him to go. I could see him through the office window, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his careful composure completely shattered. "Should I call the police?" Robert asked, clearly concerned about the potential for escalation. I shook my head. "Not yet. Let me talk to him first. But have security stay close." I walked down to the lobby, where Marcus was waiting with the desperate energy of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. When he saw me coming, he rushed toward me, stopping just short of actual physical contact. "Mom, we need to talk. Privately. This whole thing has gotten out of hand, and we need to find a way to work this out." I looked at my son, seeing the panic in his eyes, the sweat on his forehead despite the cool weather, the way his hands were shaking. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of the maternal instinct that had guided me for so many years. But then I remembered his threats, his willingness to destroy my life for money, and my resolve hardened. "Marcus, there's nothing to work out. You made your choice when you decided to try to have me declared incompetent. You made your choice when you threatened to make my life miserable if I didn't surrender my home. You made your choice when you called APS on your own mother. Now you get to live with the consequences of those choices." His mask of reasonability slipped completely then, revealing the ugly desperation underneath. "Mom, you don't understand. I need this job. I have obligations, debts, people depending on me. You can't just destroy my life because you're angry about a family disagreement." The casual way he dismissed his attempted elder abuse as a family disagreement told me everything I needed to know about Marcus's character. He still didn't understand what he'd done wrong, still didn't see me as anything more than an obstacle to his financial goals. "Marcus, I'm not destroying your life. You destroyed your own life when you decided that money was more important than family loyalty. I'm just declining to subsidize your lifestyle anymore." He stepped closer, and I could see the security guards tensing, ready to intervene if necessary. "Mom, I can make this very difficult for you. The guardianship petition is already drafted. I have documentation of your supposed incompetence. I can drag this through the courts for years, cost you hundreds of thousands in legal fees, destroy your reputation in this community." There it was again, the same threats he'd been making for weeks. But now they sounded hollow, desperate, like the bluffing of someone who'd just lost their last hand at poker. "Marcus, you're welcome to try. But you might want to consider a few things first. You're now unemployed, which means you can't afford the kind of legal representation you'd need for a protracted court battle. I, on the other hand, have substantial resources and have already retained excellent counsel. More importantly, everyone in this building just heard you publicly threaten your elderly mother after being fired for attempting to defraud her. How do you think that's going to play in front of a judge?" The realization was dawning on Marcus that his morning's humiliation had actually made his situation much worse, not better. By revealing his true nature in front of witnesses, he'd undermined any claim he might have had to being a concerned son acting in his mother's best interests. "Furthermore," I continued, "you seem to forget that I own multiple properties in this area. Your reputation in the real estate and property management community is now essentially destroyed. Even if you could find another job, who's going to hire someone who's been publicly exposed as trying to defraud his own mother?" Marcus's face cycled through several emotions before settling on a cold fury that reminded me uncomfortably of his father. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've thought of everything. But there are things you don't know, Mom. Things that could surprise you." The threat was vague but ominous, and I felt a chill of real fear for the first time that day. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say that your little victory here today might be shorter-lived than you think. I've been planning for various contingencies, and just because one plan didn't work out doesn't mean I'm out of options." Before I could ask what he meant, Marcus turned and walked out of the building, leaving me standing in the lobby with more questions than answers. Whatever he was planning next, it was clear that losing his job had only made him more desperate and potentially more dangerous. That afternoon, I drove home with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. I'd succeeded in exposing Marcus's true nature and removing him from a position where he could potentially cause damage to my business interests. But I'd also escalated the conflict between us to a level where reconciliation was no longer possible. We were now enemies in the most fundamental sense, and I had no idea what he might do next. Eleanor was waiting for me when I got home, sitting on my front porch with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression. "Leona, honey, how did it go?" I told her everything, from Marcus's shock when he realized I owned the building to his ominous threats before leaving. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally shaking her head or muttering under her breath about ungrateful children. "Well, you certainly showed him who's boss," she said when I finished. "But what do you think he meant about having other options?" That was the question that had been gnawing at me all afternoon. Marcus was desperate now, unemployed, and facing the collapse of everything he'd built. Desperate people do desperate things, and my son had already demonstrated that he was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get what he wanted. "I don't know, Eleanor, but I'm not taking any chances. I'm going to call James Morrison and make sure all my legal protections are in place. And I think it might be time to have that conversation with the police about Marcus's threats." That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, I'd gone from being Marcus's victim to being his nemesis. I'd used my financial power to destroy his career and his reputation, just as he'd threatened to destroy my independence and my dignity. Part of me felt guilty about the public humiliation I'd inflicted on him. After all, despite everything he'd done, Marcus was still my son, and some maternal instinct still wanted to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. But a larger part of me felt a grim satisfaction at having turned the tables on someone who'd tried to prey on what he perceived as my weakness. The phone rang around 8 o'clock, and I saw Lisa's number on the caller ID. She'd heard about what happened at Riverside from a friend who worked in the building, and she was calling to check on me. "Grandma, are you okay? I heard Dad got fired today, and that it was pretty dramatic." I gave Lisa a condensed version of the day's events, focusing on the business aspects rather than the personal drama. But even the sanitized version was enough to leave her speechless for several minutes. "Grandma, I had no idea you owned Dad's building. That's incredible. And he never knew?" I explained how I deliberately kept my real estate investments private, using management companies and corporate structures to maintain my anonymity. It had been a deliberate strategy to avoid exactly the kind of situation I was now dealing with, people targeting me because they knew about my assets. But now Dad knows everything, doesn't he? About your money, your properties, everything. That was exactly what worried me. Marcus now knew that I had far more resources than he'd realized, which might make him more desperate but also more creative in his attempts to access those resources. A man who was willing to try elder abuse to steal a house might be willing to try almost anything to get his hands on a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. "Lisa, I need you to be very careful for the next few weeks. Your father is desperate now, and desperate people sometimes do things that hurt innocent bystanders. I don't think he'd ever try to harm you directly, but he might try to use you to get to me." Lisa was quiet for a moment. "Grandma, are you scared of him?" The question forced me to confront something I'd been trying not to think about. "Yes, honey, I am. Not physically, necessarily, but scared of what he might do next. Today I proved that I'm not the helpless victim he thought I was, but I also made him more desperate than ever, and I still don't know what he meant about having other options." After we hung up, I double-checked all my locks, closed all my curtains, and made sure my cell phone was fully charged. I'd won today's battle decisively, but the war was far from over. Marcus had showed me exactly what kind of person he'd become, and people like that don't simply accept defeat and walk away. As I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked older than I had that morning, more tired, but also somehow stronger. The woman looking back at me wasn't the confused, helpless victim Marcus had tried to create. She was someone who'd built a substantial business empire through careful planning and smart decisions. Someone who'd raised a child as a single mother while working multiple jobs. Someone who'd survived decades of challenges and setbacks and had emerged stronger each time. Marcus had made the mistake of seeing only what he wanted to see, an elderly woman he could manipulate and control. But he'd awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long, the fierce determination that had gotten me through every other crisis in my life. He wanted to see what happened when you tried to destroy Leona Davis. He was about to find out that some battles you win by being smarter, not stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, I was certain of that. Marcus wouldn't simply accept his defeat and disappear quietly into the night. But whatever he tried next, he'd be facing a woman who was no longer surprised by his capacity for cruelty, no longer constrained by maternal sentiment, and no longer willing to be anyone's victim. The game had changed completely, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I was the one holding all the cards. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through my windows despite the furnace running at full capacity. I woke up before dawn, my body tense with the kind of anticipation that comes when you know trouble is brewing but can't quite see its shape yet. Marcus's parting words from the day before kept echoing in my mind, his mention of contingencies and other options that I supposedly didn't know about. I was making my morning coffee when I heard the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw a white sedan with government plates, and my stomach immediately dropped. Two people in business attire were walking up my front walkway, and even from a distance, I could tell this wasn't a social call. The knock on my door was official and authoritative. I opened it to find a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a younger man, both carrying leather portfolios and wearing the kind of serious expressions that meant paperwork and problems. "Mrs. Davis? I'm Detective Sarah Rodriguez with the Financial Crimes Unit, and this is Agent Mike Chen from the State Attorney General's office. We need to speak with you about some irregularities that have been reported regarding your financial accounts." My blood ran cold. This was what Marcus had been hinting at, his backup plan, when the guardianship petition and property manipulation hadn't worked. He'd somehow managed to get law enforcement involved, probably with fabricated evidence designed to make me look like either a victim of financial exploitation or a perpetrator of some kind of fraud. "Of course, please come in," I said, maintaining my composure even though my mind was racing. "Can I offer you coffee?" They declined politely and settled into my living room, pulling out official-looking documents and a digital recorder. Detective Rodriguez took the lead, her voice professional but not unkind. "Mrs. Davis, we've received reports suggesting that you may be the victim of financial elder abuse, specifically involving unauthorized access to your bank accounts and investment portfolios. There are also allegations that you may have been coerced into making property transfers or other financial decisions under duress." I almost laughed at the irony. Marcus had tried to frame this as if he was the concerned party reporting my supposed victimization, when in reality he was the one who'd been trying to perpetrate exactly those crimes against me. "I can assure you, Detective Rodriguez, that I have not been the victim of any financial abuse. My accounts are secure, I make all my own financial decisions, and I have not been coerced into any property transfers or investments." Agent Chen leaned forward, consulting his notes. "Mrs. Davis, we have documentation suggesting that significant sums of money have been moved from your accounts recently, and that there may have been attempts to establish power of attorney arrangements without your full understanding or consent." This was clearly Marcus's handiwork. He must have used his brief access to my financial information, combined with the forged documents he'd already created, to build a case suggesting that someone was exploiting me financially. The genius of it was that it would force me to prove my competency, while simultaneously creating an official investigation that could tie up my assets for months. "I'd be happy to provide you with complete access to all my financial records," I said, reaching for my phone. "I can also put you in touch with my attorney, my financial advisor, and my bank manager, all of whom can verify that I am fully competent and have been managing my own affairs without any outside interference." Detective Rodriguez and Agent Chen exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to reconcile the alert, articulate woman sitting across from them with the confused victim they'd apparently been led to expect. "Mrs. Davis," Detective Rodriguez said carefully, "can you tell us about your relationship with your son, Marcus Davis?" There it was. The question that would force me to either protect Marcus or tell the truth about what he'd been trying to do to me. I'd spent 38 years putting my son's welfare ahead of my own, but those days were over. "Detective, my son has been attempting to gain control of my assets through fraudulent means. He's tried to have me declared mentally incompetent, filed false property complaints, and has been systematically trying to isolate me from my support network. I believe he's the one who made the report that brought you here today, as part of his ongoing campaign to undermine my independence." I spent the next 2 hours laying out everything for the investigators, providing them with copies of all the documentation I'd been gathering, playing them recordings of Marcus's threats, and explaining the timeline of his escalating attempts at manipulation and coercion. I called James Morrison, my attorney, who arrived within 30 minutes and provided additional legal context for the situation. By the time Detective Rodriguez and Agent Chen left my house, it was clear that the investigation had taken a very different direction than they'd anticipated. Instead of investigating my supposed victimization, they were now looking into Marcus's attempts to defraud me. The irony was perfect. Marcus's attempt to use law enforcement against me had actually backfired and given me official documentation of his criminal behavior. But I knew this was only the beginning. Marcus wasn't the type to give up after one setback, and losing his job had probably made him more desperate rather than more cautious. I spent the afternoon reinforcing my security measures, changing passwords on all my accounts, and putting additional protections in place for my properties and investments. That evening, Eleanor came over with a casserole and a bottle of wine, insisting that I needed both comfort food and alcohol after the day I'd had. We sat in my kitchen, sharing the meal and talking through everything that had happened. Leona, I have to ask, what do you think Marcus is going to try next? He's lost his job, his reputation is ruined, and now he's potentially facing criminal charges. What does a person like that do when they're cornered? It was a question I'd been pondering all day. Marcus had always been resourceful, even as a child, and he'd demonstrated a willingness to escalate situations far beyond what any reasonable person would consider appropriate. But now he was facing the complete collapse of his life, and people in that situation sometimes do things that surprise everyone, including themselves. I honestly don't know, Eleanor, but I'm worried that he might try something more direct, more personal. He's run out of legal and financial avenues, so what's left? My question was answered sooner than I expected. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the distinctive scraping noise of someone trying to pick the lock on my back door. I immediately called 911 while moving to a position where I could see the door without being visible from outside. The person working on my lock was clearly skilled, methodical rather than frantic, suggesting this wasn't some random break-in attempt. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of a dark jacket and baseball cap, but couldn't make out any identifying features. The lock-picking continued for several minutes before whoever it was apparently gave up and moved away from the door. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by then my uninvited visitor was long gone. The officers found clear evidence of tampering with the lock mechanism, and they took detailed photographs and fingerprint samples from the door frame and handle. But without catching the perpetrator in the act, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report and increasing patrols in my neighborhood. I spent that night sleeping fitfully, jumping at every sound and checking the locks every few hours. The attempted break-in had crossed a line from financial manipulation to potential physical threat, and I was beginning to understand that Marcus's desperation might drive him to violence. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted "thief" across my garage door in large red letters, along with what appeared to be my address and the words, "Beware scammer" underneath. It was clearly designed to humiliate me in front of my neighbors and potentially damage my reputation in the community. I called the police again to report the vandalism, and this time they took it more seriously, especially when I explained about the previous evening's attempted break-in and the ongoing conflict with Marcus. They assured me that they would increase patrols and recommended that I consider installing additional security measures. But the graffiti had the opposite effect from what Marcus had probably intended. Instead of turning my neighbors against me, it brought them together in support. Carol from next door came over with paint remover and brushes, insisting that we clean up the mess together. Margaret from down the street brought coffee and offered to organize a neighborhood watch program. Even people I barely knew stopped by to ask if I was okay and to offer their help. By noon, not only was the graffiti completely removed, but I had a small army of neighbors keeping an eye on my property and a list of phone numbers to call if I needed anything. Marcus's attempt to isolate me had actually strengthened my community connections, giving me more support and protection than I'd had before. That afternoon, James Morrison called with an update on the legal situation. The investigation into Marcus's financial fraud allegations was proceeding rapidly, and the evidence was overwhelming. More importantly, the The district attorney's office was now taking a serious look at filing criminal charges against Marcus for attempted elder abuse, fraud, and possibly extortion. Leona, I have to be honest with you, this could get uglier before it gets better. If Marcus is facing serious criminal charges, he might become even more desperate. Have you considered staying somewhere else for a while, just until things settle down? I'd been thinking about that exact question since the attempted break-in. Part of me wanted to flee, to get as far away from Marcus and his escalating behavior as possible. But a larger part of me refused to be driven from my own home by threats and intimidation. James, I've spent my entire life fighting for what's mine. I'm not going to let my own son chase me out of my house just because he's having a tantrum about not getting his inheritance early. That evening, I was surprised by an unexpected visitor. Lisa arrived at my door carrying an overnight bag and wearing the determined expression I'd inherited from my own mother. Grandma, I'm staying here for a while. I've talked to my professors about taking my classes remotely for a few weeks, and I'm not leaving you alone to deal with Dad's crazy behavior. I protested that I didn't need protection, that I could take care of myself, but Lisa was having none of it. She'd inherited the family's stubbornness, and once she'd made up her mind about something, arguing was pointless. Besides, she said as she settled into the guest room, someone needs to be here to witness whatever Dad tries next. If this ends up in court, we'll need testimony from people who saw his behavior firsthand. Having Lisa in the house changed the entire dynamic. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could relax, could sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. More importantly, I felt like I had an ally who understood both Marcus's nature and the stakes involved. The next few days passed quietly, almost suspiciously so. Marcus didn't call, didn't show up, didn't send any threatening messages. It was like he'd simply vanished, which somehow made me more nervous than his previous escalating behavior had. I knew he wasn't done, that he was probably planning something bigger and more devastating than anything he'd tried before. My suspicions were confirmed on Friday morning when James Morrison called with urgent news. Leona, we have a problem. Marcus has filed a lawsuit against you, claiming that you illegally seized his employment and destroyed his reputation through false accusations. He's seeking damages for lost income, emotional distress, and defamation. I felt my blood pressure spike. James, he's suing me for firing him from a job at a company I own? It gets worse. He's also filed an emergency petition with the court, claiming that your recent erratic behavior, including the public humiliation at his workplace, demonstrates that you're mentally unstable and pose a danger to yourself and others. He's requesting immediate temporary guardianship pending a full competency evaluation. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus was now claiming that my resistance to his fraud attempts was evidence of mental instability, that my refusal to be victimized was proof that I needed a guardian. He was trying to turn my strength against me, to use my very competence as evidence of incompetence. There's more, Leona. He somehow obtained a court order for a psychological evaluation, claiming that your recent actions demonstrate paranoid delusions and poor judgment. You're required to appear for evaluation next Wednesday. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, feeling the walls closing in around me. Marcus had found a way to weaponize the legal system against me, to force me into a position where I'd have to prove my sanity to strangers who didn't know me or understand the context of our conflict. James, can we fight this? We're going to try, but it's complicated. Courts take elder protection very seriously, and Marcus has framed this as a concerned son, trying to protect his mother from her own increasingly erratic behavior. He's even provided testimony from former colleagues claiming that you appeared confused and hostile during your visit to Riverside Apartments. The chess game had reached a new level of complexity. Marcus was now using witnesses from his former workplace, people who'd only seen me during that one dramatic confrontation, to support his claim that I was mentally unstable. To them, I probably had appeared erratic and hostile, because they hadn't understood the context of what was happening. That afternoon, Lisa and I sat in my living room, going through all the documentation and evidence we'd gathered over the past few weeks. We needed to build a comprehensive case that demonstrated not only my competency, but also Marcus's pattern of manipulation and fraud. Grandma, what if we turn this around on him? Instead of just defending against his accusations, What if we go on the offensive? I looked at my granddaughter, seeing the sharp intelligence that reminded me of myself at her age. What do you have in mind? Lisa pulled out her laptop and started typing. We document everything, but we also start gathering evidence about Dad's financial situation, his debts, his desperate need for money. We show the court that his concern isn't about your welfare, it's about his own financial survival. It was a good strategy, but it would require us to dig into Marcus's private affairs in ways that felt invasive and uncomfortable. On the other hand, he'd been trying to invade my privacy and autonomy for weeks, so perhaps turnabout was fair play. Over the weekend, Lisa and I conducted our own investigation into Marcus's financial situation. What we found was eye-opening and disturbing. Marcus was drowning in debt, with credit cards maxed out, loan payments in arrears, and a lifestyle that far exceeded his income. His luxury apartment, his expensive car, his designer clothes, all of it was financed through borrowing against his expected future earnings. More troubling, we discovered that Marcus had been telling people, including potential creditors, that he was expecting a substantial inheritance in the near future. He'd been using my assumed eventual death as collateral for his current lifestyle, essentially betting other people's money on his ability to access my assets sooner rather than later. Grandma, look at this, Lisa said, showing me a loan application she'd found through her internet research. Dad listed you as a reference and claimed that you'd verbally promised him the house and a significant portion of your savings. He used that promise to qualify for a personal loan of $50,000. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just been planning to steal my assets. He'd already been spending money based on his expectation of accessing those assets. His entire financial house of cards depended on gaining control of my estate, which explained why he'd become so desperate when I'd resisted his initial attempts at manipulation. Monday morning, James Morrison and I met with Dr. Patricia Williams to prepare for the court-ordered psychological evaluation. Dr. Williams had been my physician for years and was outraged by the suggestion that I was mentally incompetent, but she also understood the seriousness of the legal challenge I was facing. Leona, the evaluator, is going to be looking for any signs of paranoia, confusion, or poor judgment. Unfortunately, some of your recent actions, like the public confrontation with Marcus at his workplace, could be interpreted as impulsive or vindictive behavior. I felt a flash of anger at the unfairness of it all. Dr. Williams, I exposed my son's fraud and removed him from a position where he could damage my business interests. How is that poor judgment? It's not, but context matters in these evaluations. The evaluator won't know about Marcus's threats or his history of manipulation. They'll just see an elderly woman who publicly humiliated her son and cost him his job. James nodded grimly. Which is exactly how Marcus has framed it in his petition. He's painted himself as the victim of your increasing paranoia and hostility. We spent 2 hours going over every aspect of my recent behavior, identifying potential weak points in my story, and developing strategies for presenting my actions in the most favorable light possible. It felt like preparing for battle, which in many ways it was. The psychological evaluation was scheduled for Wednesday morning at the county courthouse. As Lisa and I drove downtown, I tried to calm my nerves by focusing on the facts. I was competent, capable, and fully in control of my faculties. The truth was on my side, even if Marcus had managed to muddy the waters with his accusations and manipulations. Dr. Rebecca Stevens, the court-appointed evaluator, was a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. The evaluation took place in a sterile conference room, with just the 3 of us present, and a digital recorder capturing every word. The questioning was thorough and sometimes uncomfortable. Dr. Stevens asked about my daily routines, my financial management, my relationships with family and friends. She administered cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychological inventories designed to detect signs of dementia, paranoia, or other mental health issues. But she also asked pointed questions about my conflict with Marcus, clearly trying to determine whether my accusations against him were based in reality or were the product of delusional thinking. Mrs. Davis, your son has provided testimony suggesting that you've become increasingly suspicious and hostile toward him in recent months. He claims that you've accused him of trying to steal from you without any real evidence. How do you respond to that? This was the moment everything hinged on. I took a deep breath and began laying out the facts, providing specific dates, times, and details about Marcus's threats and manipulations. I showed Dr. Stevens copies of the forged documents, played recordings of his threatening phone calls, and provided testimony from witnesses who'd seen his behavior firsthand. Dr. Stevens, my son has been systematically trying to gain control of my assets through fraudulent means. This isn't paranoia or suspicion. This is documented fact. I have police reports, legal documents, and witness statements to support everything I'm telling you. The evaluation lasted 4 hours, and by the end, I could see that Dr. Stevens's initial skepticism had given way to something that looked like concern. Not concern about my mental state, but concern about the situation I was describing. Mrs. Davis, I need to ask you directly, do you believe your son poses a physical threat to you? The question forced me to confront something I'd been trying not to think about. Dr. Stevens, I don't know. A week ago, I would have said no, but someone tried to break into my house, someone vandalized my property, and Marcus has made increasingly desperate threats. I can't say with certainty that he wouldn't try to harm me if he thought it would get him what he wants. That evening, Lisa and I waited anxiously for Dr. Stevens's report. James had warned us that it could take several days, but the waiting was agony. My entire future hung in the balance of one woman's assessment of my mental competence, and there was nothing I could do but wait. The call came Friday afternoon. James's voice was carefully controlled when he delivered the news, but I could hear the relief underneath his professional demeanor. Leona, Dr. Stevens found no evidence of mental incompetence or cognitive decline. Her report states that you demonstrate excellent memory, sound judgment, and appropriate emotional responses to a genuinely threatening situation. She's recommended that the guardianship petition be denied, and that the court investigate Marcus's allegations more thoroughly. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. The official validation of my competency was more than just a legal victory. It was proof that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating Marcus's behavior, that my perceptions and responses had been appropriate and rational. But James wasn't finished. There's more, Leona. Dr. Stevens was sufficiently concerned about Marcus's behavior that she's recommended a restraining order. She believes that his escalating threats and manipulation tactics constitute a pattern of elder abuse that could lead to physical harm. That afternoon, I sat in my living room with Lisa, finally allowing myself to feel the relief and exhaustion that I'd been holding back for weeks. The psychological evaluation had been the last major hurdle in proving my competency, and now that it was behind me, I could start thinking about moving forward rather than just defending against attacks. Grandma, what happens now? I mean, Dad's not just going to give up and disappear, is he? Lisa was right to be concerned. Marcus had now lost his job, his reputation, his legal case, and soon he'd probably face criminal charges for his attempted fraud. People in that situation don't usually go quietly into the night. They tend to lash out in increasingly desperate and dangerous ways. I don't know, honey. But whatever he tries next, at least now we have official documentation that I'm competent and that he's been the one behaving inappropriately. That changes the whole dynamic. That weekend, I made a decision that surprised even myself. Instead of waiting for Marcus's next move, I was going to make one of my own. I called Robert Chen at Pinnacle Property Management and asked him to arrange a meeting with all the tenants at Riverside Apartments. Mrs. Davis, may I ask what you're planning to discuss with them? I smiled, thinking about the conversation I was about to have with dozens of people who were still dealing with the aftermath of Marcus's very public firing. Robert, I think it's time for me to introduce myself properly to my tenants and explain some changes I'm making to how the building is managed. Monday evening, the community room at Riverside Apartments was packed with curious tenants who'd been told that the building's owner wanted to address them directly. Most of them had heard about the dramatic scene with Marcus the previous week, but few understood the full context of what had happened. I stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to concerned to slightly suspicious. These people lived in my building, paid rent that supported my retirement, and deserved to know the truth about their landlord. and the recent upheaval in the building's management. Good evening, everyone. As you know, I'm Leona Davis, and I own this building. Some of you witnessed some dramatic events here last week, and I wanted to take this opportunity to explain what happened and to assure you that your housing situation is secure. I spent the next 30 minutes telling them about Marcus's attempts to defraud me, about how he'd used his position in the building as leverage in his campaign against me, and about the steps I was taking to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. I was honest about the family conflict but focused on the business and ethical issues rather than the personal drama. I want to assure all of you that despite the unfortunate situation with the previous property manager, this building will continue to be well-maintained and professionally managed. Your leases are secure, your rent will not increase beyond normal market rates, and any concerns you have will be addressed promptly and fairly. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several tenants thanked me for my transparency and for handling a difficult situation with professionalism. Others offered support and expressed their appreciation for the way I'd managed the building over the years. But most importantly, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. By addressing the situation directly and honestly, I was taking control of the narrative and ensuring that Marcus's version of events didn't become the accepted truth in my own building. As the meeting was wrapping up, Robert pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Davis, I need to tell you something. Marcus was here this afternoon, trying to get into the building. Security refused him entry, but he was asking questions about you, about your schedule, about when you'd be coming back." The news sent a chill down my spine. Marcus was still watching, still planning, still looking for opportunities to cause damage. Despite all the legal and professional setbacks he'd suffered, he wasn't ready to give up. That night, as Lisa and I drove home from the tenant meeting, I made a mental note to increase security measures and to be even more careful about my daily routines. Marcus had shown that he was willing to escalate beyond financial manipulation to property damage and attempted break-ins. The next step might be direct confrontation, and I needed to be prepared for that possibility. "Grandma," Lisa said as we pulled into my driveway, "I've been thinking about something. What if Dad's behavior isn't just about money anymore? What if it's about revenge? About making you pay for humiliating him and destroying his life?" It was a sobering thought. Marcus had always been prideful, even as a child, and the public nature of his downfall had probably wounded him more deeply than the financial consequences. A person seeking revenge might be even more dangerous than someone seeking money, because revenge isn't rational or limited by practical considerations. As we walked up to my front door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tucked under my doormat was a single piece of paper, folded neatly and clearly placed there recently. With shaking hands, I unfolded it and read the message written in Marcus's familiar handwriting. "Mom, you think you've won, but this is far from over. You took everything from me, and I'm going to return the favor. Sleep well." Lisa read the note over my shoulder and immediately pulled out her phone to call the police. But as we waited for them to arrive, I realized that Marcus had crossed yet another line. This wasn't just attempted fraud or financial manipulation anymore. This was a direct threat, a promise of retaliation that could take any form and come at any time. The game between Marcus and me had reached its final phase, and I had no idea what my son was capable of when driven by desperation and revenge. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let him destroy me, no matter what he tried next. The police took Marcus's threatening note seriously, especially given the recent pattern of escalating behavior they'd been documenting. Officer Jennifer Walsh, who'd become familiar with my case over the past few weeks, photographed the note and added it to the growing file of evidence against my son. "Mrs. Davis, this crosses the line into criminal threatening. Combined with the attempted break-in and vandalism, we now have enough to arrest him if we can locate him. Do you have any idea where he might be staying?" I realized with a start that I had no idea where Marcus was living now that he'd lost his job and presumably couldn't afford his luxury apartment anymore. For all I knew, he could be sleeping in his car or staying with friends, which would make him even more unpredictable and dangerous. "Officer Walsh, I honestly don't know. He lost his apartment when he lost his job, and I don't think he has many close friends he could impose on for long." That night, Lisa insisted on staying in my room, setting up a makeshift bed on the floor despite my protests that it wasn't necessary. But having her nearby helped me sleep, knowing that someone else was listening for unusual sounds and watching for signs of trouble. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Sarah Rodriguez, the detective who'd been investigating Marcus's fraud allegations. Her voice was tense when she delivered news that made my stomach clench with dread. "Mrs. Davis, we've been trying to locate Marcus for questioning regarding the fraud investigation, but he seems to have disappeared. His apartment has been vacated, his car was found abandoned in a downtown parking garage, and none of his known associates have seen him in several days." The implications were terrifying. Marcus had gone underground, which meant he was either planning something desperate or he'd already fled the area to avoid prosecution. Either scenario left me feeling vulnerable and exposed. "Detective Rodriguez, what does this mean for my safety? If he's disappeared, how can you protect me from whatever he's planning?" "We're increasing patrols in your neighborhood and putting out a be on the lookout alert for Marcus. But Mrs. Davis, I have to be honest with you. If someone is determined to cause harm and they don't care about the consequences, it's very difficult to stop them completely." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to process the reality of my situation. My own son had become a fugitive, someone law enforcement couldn't locate and couldn't predict. The person who knew my routines, my habits, my vulnerabilities better than almost anyone was now actively working against me with nothing left to lose. Lisa found me there an hour later, staring out the window at my backyard, and probably looking as lost as I felt. She sat down across from me, reaching over to squeeze my hand with the kind of gentle strength that reminded me why I'd been fighting so hard to protect my independence. "Grandma, I've been thinking about this situation, and I have an idea. What if we don't wait for Dad to make his next move? What if we force his hand instead?" I looked at my granddaughter, seeing the determined intelligence that had carried our family through so many challenges over the years. "What do you have in mind, honey?" Lisa pulled out her laptop and opened a social media page I didn't recognize. "I've been monitoring Dad's online activity, and he's been posting some pretty disturbing stuff on his personal accounts. Rants about ungrateful family members, complaints about being betrayed by people he trusted, threats about getting justice for what's been done to him." She showed me screenshots of Marcus's recent posts, and I was shocked by the raw anger and bitterness in his words. These weren't the measured, manipulative communications I'd come to expect from him. These were the ravings of someone who'd lost all perspective and self-control. "Lisa, this doesn't look like your father at all. It's like he's become someone completely different." "That's exactly my point, Grandma. Dad's not thinking clearly anymore. He's operating on pure emotion, which means he's making mistakes. And if we can anticipate those mistakes, we can use them against him." Lisa's plan was both simple and brilliant. Instead of hiding and waiting for Marcus to find me, we would create a situation where he would expose himself, forcing him to act in a way that would lead to his capture. It was risky, but it was also proactive, giving us some control over the timing and circumstances of the confrontation. "The key is to make him think he has an opportunity that's too good to pass up," Lisa explained. "Something that appeals to his desire for revenge, while also making him careless enough to get caught." We spent the rest of the morning developing our strategy, working out details and contingencies while staying in constant communication with law enforcement. Detective Rodriguez was initially skeptical of our plan, but when we showed her Marcus's increasingly unhinged social media posts, she agreed that waiting passively might not be the safest option. Wednesday afternoon, we put our plan into motion. Lisa posted on her own social media accounts that she was taking me to my doctor's appointment Thursday morning, and that we'd be gone from the house for several hours. The post was carefully crafted to sound casual, while providing enough specific information that Marcus would see it as an opportunity. "The beauty of this," Lisa explained as we reviewed our preparations, "is that Dad thinks he knows my social media habits. He doesn't realize I've been monitoring his accounts and adjusting my posts specifically to give him information." Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made everything feel ominous and uncertain. Lisa and I left the house at exactly the time she'd indicated in her social media post, but instead of going to a doctor's appointment, we drove to a coffee shop 3 blocks away where we could watch my house without being seen. Detective Rodriguez and 2 other officers were positioned in unmarked cars around my neighborhood, ready to move the moment Marcus showed up. We'd installed additional security cameras the day before, giving us multiple angles on anyone approaching the property. For the first hour, nothing happened. I began to wonder if Marcus had seen through our deception, or if he'd decided not to take the bait. But just after 10 o'clock, Lisa's phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. "Grandma, look at this." She showed me the camera feed on her phone, and my blood ran cold. Marcus was in my backyard, moving purposefully toward the back door with what looked like a crowbar in his hand. Lisa immediately called Detective Rodriguez while I watched my son attempt to break into my house in broad daylight. He'd apparently learned from his previous failed attempt, bringing proper tools and working more efficiently. Within minutes, he'd forced the back door open and disappeared inside. "They're moving in now," Lisa said, relaying information from her phone call with the detective. "They want to catch him inside the house, so there's no question about his intent." We watched the camera feeds as police officers surrounded my house, positioning themselves at all the exits before moving in to make the arrest. I found myself holding my breath, realizing that this confrontation would finally end the nightmare that had consumed my life for the past month. The arrest happened quickly, and without violence. Marcus was apprehended in my living room, apparently searching through my desk for financial documents or anything else he could use against me. The look on his face when the police officers appeared was a mixture of shock, rage, and something that might have been relief. By the time Lisa and I returned to the house, Marcus was in handcuffs and being loaded into a police car. He saw me standing on my front walkway and started shouting, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "This isn't over, Mom. You think you've won, but you've destroyed your own family. You chose money over your son, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life." I watched the police car drive away with my son inside, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that would probably take years to fully process. Relief that the immediate threat was over, sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to this point, and a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Detective Rodriguez briefed us on what would happen next. Marcus would be charged with breaking and entering, criminal threatening, harassment, and attempted fraud. Given his recent pattern of escalating behavior and his status as a fugitive, it was unlikely he'd be released on bail. "Mrs. Davis, I know this has been an incredibly difficult situation, but you should know that your willingness to document everything and work with law enforcement made all the difference. Without that evidence, this could have dragged on for months or years." That afternoon, James Morrison called with additional news about the legal ramifications of Marcus's arrest. The district attorney's office was now treating this as a serious elder abuse case, which carried significant penalties under state law. Marcus was looking at potential prison time, not just fines or probation. "Leona, I also want you to know that the civil lawsuit Marcus filed against you will almost certainly be dismissed now that he's been arrested for the very behavior he was accusing you of imagining. His credibility is completely destroyed." Over the following days, the full scope of Marcus's financial desperation became clear through court documents and police reports. He owed over $200,000 to various creditors, had been lying about his income and assets for years, and had been counting on accessing my estate to avoid bankruptcy. More disturbing was the discovery that Marcus had been researching ways to have elderly people declared incompetent, studying successful cases and learning strategies for manipulation. This hadn't been a spontaneous act of greed. It had been a carefully planned campaign to systematically destroy my autonomy and steal my assets. Lisa found some of his research on a laptop the police had confiscated, and reading through it was like looking into the mind of a stranger. The Marcus who had planned this campaign against me bore no resemblance to the son I'd raised, the young man I'd loved and supported for 38 years. "Grandma, I keep thinking about who Dad used to be, or who I thought he was. Was he always capable of this, or did something change him?" It was a question I'd been asking myself constantly. Looking back over the years, I could see warning signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. Marcus's sense of entitlement, his casual cruelty toward people he saw as beneath him, his tendency to blame others for his problems. Perhaps the capacity for this behavior had always been there, waiting for the right combination of opportunity and desperation to emerge. 2 weeks after Marcus's arrest, I received a letter from him in jail. It was handwritten on standard prison stationery, and I almost threw it away without reading it. But something made me open it, perhaps a need to understand his perspective, or a lingering hope that he might show some remorse for what he'd done. The letter was not what I expected. Instead of apologies or explanations, it was a rambling justification for his behavior, full of self-pity and blame directed at everyone but himself. He claimed that I'd forced him into desperate measures by being selfish with money that should have been his inheritance. He accused me of manipulating the situation to make him look like the villain when he'd only been trying to secure his financial future. Most disturbing was his continued insistence that he'd been in the right, that everything he'd done was justified by my supposed obligation to support him financially. Even facing prison time, Marcus couldn't accept responsibility for his choices or acknowledge the harm he'd caused. I read the letter once, then burned it in my fireplace. Whatever Marcus had become, he was no longer my son in any meaningful sense. The person who'd written that letter was a stranger, someone who'd chosen greed and self-pity over family loyalty and basic human decency. The trial took place 3 months later, and I testified about everything Marcus had done, from his initial threats to his escalating campaign of harassment and fraud. It was emotionally exhausting, but also cathartic, finally having the opportunity to tell the complete truth in an official forum where it would be taken seriously. Marcus's defense attorney tried to portray him as a desperate son worried about his mother's welfare, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The recordings, documents, witness testimony, and his own social media posts painted a clear picture of premeditated elder abuse and attempted fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years conditional on making full restitution for his attempted theft. I felt no satisfaction watching my son led away in shackles, only a profound sadness for what our relationship had become, and what it might have been if he'd made different choices. But I also felt a sense of closure, knowing that the legal system had validated my experience, and that other families might be protected from similar abuse. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life and restoring the sense of security and peace that Marcus's campaign had shattered. I increased security at all my properties, updated my will and estate planning documents, and established new protocols for managing my investments. Most importantly, I strengthened my relationships with the people who'd stood by me during the crisis. Eleanor, Margaret, Carol, and especially Lisa had shown me what real family loyalty looked like, and I wanted to make sure they knew how much their support had meant to me. I also began volunteering with a local organization that helped elderly people who were victims of financial abuse. My experience with Marcus had taught me how vulnerable older adults could be to manipulation, especially from family members who exploited emotional bonds for financial gain. Speaking to other survivors of elder abuse was both heartbreaking and inspiring. I met people who'd lost their life savings to manipulative children, grandparents who'd been isolated from their support networks by greedy relatives, and elderly individuals who'd been convinced they were incompetent when they were actually sharp and capable. But I also met people who'd fought back, who'd refused to be victims, who'd used the legal system and their own determination to protect themselves and others. These conversations reminded me that my conflict with Marcus wasn't just a personal family drama. It was part of a larger social problem that required awareness, education, and advocacy. A year after Marcus's sentencing, I received another letter from him in prison. This one was different from the first, shorter and more reflective. He didn't apologize exactly, but he acknowledged that his behavior had been wrong, and that he understood why I'd felt threatened and betrayed. He also mentioned that he'd been participating in therapy and educational programs in prison, working on understanding the choices that had led him to this point. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign that Marcus might be capable of genuine self-reflection and change. I didn't respond to the letter, but I didn't burn it either. I filed it away with all the other documents from our ordeal, evidence of a family crisis that had tested everyone involved and revealed truths that some of us hadn't wanted to face. Lisa graduated from college that spring with honors, and I was proud to attend her ceremony and celebrate her achievement. She'd grown up considerably during the months of our crisis, showing maturity and strength that reminded me of myself at her age. Grandma, she said as we sat in my garden afterward, enjoying the warm afternoon and talking about her plans for graduate school. I've been thinking about what happened with Dad, and I want you to know something. What you did, fighting back the way you did, it changed how I think about aging and independence. I looked at my granddaughter, seeing the strong woman she was becoming, and feeling hopeful about the future in a way I hadn't for months. You showed me that getting older doesn't mean becoming helpless, that experience and determination can be more powerful than youth and aggression. I want to work in elder advocacy when I finish my social work degree, and it's because of what I learned watching you handle Dad's attacks. That evening, as I sat in my living room reading a book and listening to the quiet sounds of my neighborhood, I reflected on everything that had happened, and everything I'd learned about myself, my family, and the importance of fighting for what you believe in. Marcus had tried to destroy me by exploiting what he saw as my vulnerability, my age, my supposed helplessness. But in fighting back, I'd discovered reserves of strength and determination I didn't know I still possessed. I'd learned that support could come from unexpected places, that the legal system could work for justice when provided with proper evidence, and that sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who teach you the most about your own resilience. My house felt peaceful again, filled with good memories, and the promise of new experiences rather than fear and uncertainty. I'd reclaimed not just my property and my assets, but my sense of agency and control over my own life. The ordeal with Marcus had lasted only a few months, but it had changed me fundamentally. I was no longer the woman who'd trusted blindly, who'd prioritized family harmony over personal safety, who'd assumed that love and sacrifice would be reciprocated with loyalty and respect. I was someone harder but also wiser. Someone who understood that protecting yourself isn't selfish, that setting boundaries isn't cruel, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their actions. Marcus would serve his time and hopefully emerge as a better person, someone capable of taking responsibility for his choices and building healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and exploitation. But whether he changed or not, I'd already reclaimed my life and my peace of mind. The cold basement he'd threatened me with had become a metaphor for the powerlessness he'd tried to impose on me. But in the end, I was the one who remained warm and secure in my own home, surrounded by people who valued and respected me, while he faced the cold reality of consequences for his actions. I'd survived the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that comes from someone you love and trust completely. And in surviving it, I discovered that I was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than anyone, including myself, had given me credit for. The woman Marcus had tried to destroy was gone, replaced by someone who would never again mistake kindness for weakness or assume that family bonds guaranteed safety. But that transformation wasn't a loss. It was a gift, a hard-won wisdom that would protect me and others for whatever challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.